My dad was involved in cars and working for a Ford dealer on the south coast, and he persuaded him, this is the Ford dealer, to build a couple of competition spec cars and race them to generate more sales, and that was reasonably successful. And he was invited by Ford of America to bring out a Cortina to some American endurance races, and they were sort of 12-hour races, and yeah, the Cortina GTs, they were not even Lotuses, and they had some British drivers and in fact beat the Ford factory NASCAR drivers in their Falcons, which were V8 powered cars, and these little English boxy saloons weren't supposed to do that. So I think it caught their attention a little bit that you know, there was outside of America there were people who knew how to prepare cars as well. At that stage, Ford decided to hand over the rally preparation for the Monte Carlo rally in '64 with the Ford Falcon to him, and that was an enormous responsibility for him, but that prompted him to then set up a proper company and get a premises and make a proper arrangement to run the rally for Ford. In the first year, the Monte Carlo rally was nearly a very good success, but not quite. They had a Swedish driver called Bo Ljungfeld, who was older but incredibly talented, especially at that sort of thing, and he set the fastest time on every stage in Monte with this car, which at the beginning of the rally was you know, a point of mockery for the French, thinking, well, this is a great big lumbering V8, this is never going to be able to cope with our alpine roads in the snow. But Ford made a big effort and spent a lot of money, and they were very well equipped and had lots of spare cars, and it did set fastest times everywhere. And unfortunately there was a handicap system, and based on various things including engine capacity, and even though he was fastest on the road, once the handicap was applied, the Mini with Hopkirk and Mackinnon was the winner. Ford still got a lot of good marketing from it, and they were pleased with the result, I think, so it led to further activities on circuit and in sort of road rallies. And when the Mustang came out, it was entered into the Tour de France automobile in late '64, and they were first and second in that and ended a long period of Jaguar dominance. And so, yeah, the first year did bring some good results, which led to the rest of his career. I've got all the office papers here from the day, and I can't understand how he coped with all what was going on. It's extraordinary. Later on, after the GT40 project was finished, Ford wanted a new prototype to compete at Le Mans with the new 3-litre engine maximum limit. So a car was commissioned, and Len Bailey, who was partly a Ford designer, designed the car, and Cosworth did the engine, the new DFV, which was obviously an incredibly successful engine. And so it looked fantastic, and the engine was good, and there were lots of positives, but unfortunately it didn't really work out. But it was a very nice design. It was the first sports car application of a DFV, and Keith Duckworth was not particularly wild about that idea, and he saw it as a pure F1 engine, and was averse to using the engine as a stress member in the chassis and hanging the rear suspension off it and bolting the front of the engine to the bulkhead, as Lotus did in Formula One. And that meant that a big chassis had to be built around the back of it, which made engine removal and reinstallation and any problems more difficult, and more heat was involved because there was obviously exhaust, and you still had to carry a spare wheel, believe it or not, in those days. And the engine supply was a problem because everybody wanted their hands on these engines, and engines which were committed to the F3L program had to be lent off to Lotus for rounds and then come back, and it was difficult. And the car was a bit frightening to drive by all accounts, even for the Brabhams and Frank Gardners of this world. And so people didn't approach it with a great deal of confidence, even though it had a lot of pace and it was fastest lap or pole position or led wherever it went. but inevitably something went wrong and it fell out of the race and never really showed its potential. Well, there were 3 built. One was crashed very badly by Chris Irwin at the Nürburgring, and that wreck, the identity of it still survives, but it's pretty badly damaged. And the 2 other cars are still around, but not actively being raced as far as I know. One's in a museum in Belgium and the other one's in France somewhere, as far as I understand. My father was a very good organiser, I think, and pulled together a lot of really good people. And in this area at the time, there was the Vickers factory at Brooklands, which had a lot of very skilled metal workers and fabricators. And Aston Martin were quite near in Feltham and had a lot of very good engine builders and mechanics. And the time was ripe when the budget was there and he could afford to pay more than the going rate for a weekly rate for a mechanic, he could pull in the best people. And Ford were really attacking the racing in their total performance program, spending a lot of money, and they had good products, good cars, good engines to work with, and the whole package seemed to just work pretty well together. They had very good drivers, and you know, some of those obviously went on to be world champions and the heroes of the sport. So it was a good time to be in it, I think. They had a lot of fun in those days, I think. You know, it wasn't the same sort of atmosphere as professional motorsport now, and people were much more casual. There were no contracts for drivers, or things were done on handshakes, and there was a social element to it, which I don't know, but I'm not sure that all the current best crop of Grand Prix drivers are all out holidaying together in, you know, Barbados and things. But it was pretty fast and furious in those days, I think, and they were enjoying all flying about in their little aircraft and having great parties, and you know, obviously racing sports cars, touring cars, Formula One cars, and it was yeah, a very thrilling world, I expect. At the end of 1969, Ford of America had just throttled back on their racing program enormously, and Ford of Britain were committed more to rallying in those days, in the early 70s, and the option was available to continue the operation as a customer-based team rather than working with the factory. That was not attractive to my father, so he set up this a business at this airfield here, and Frank Gardner, who was still keen to have a motor racing team, took over the plant and some of the staff and set up a race shop here, which was called Motor Racing Research. And they did quite a lot of good things in the early 70s and won the BTCC and things like that. And so my father was a 50% silent partner in that arrangement. And then when Frank went back to Australia, that was all sold. But at that point, I think motor racing is a bit of an addiction, and he felt probably the need to go cold turkey at that point, and he just closed that door, and he never really talked about it a great deal, or never went to any races, didn't really see people who were his old friends, and it was a bit strange. But when Goodwood and things started in the 90s, and he got back to be invited there and see his old friends and see the old cars, then it was like a switch came back on, and he never thought about anything else until he died, really. So yes, I don't know, but aviation was a big interest for him as well, and he pursued that for the next 30 years. Some of the old mechanics from the 60s were still working on site and had their own businesses, and he knew, you know, there were still a few irons in the fire over the quiet period, and he was friendly with John Whitmore and Jack Sears and Frank Gardner quite closely. But really the first sort of Silverstone Coys festivals and the Goodwood revivals and so on completely reignited his interest, and he bought one of his old cars back and then wanted to buy one to drive and competition, and you know, then it just snowballed. And, after he died, it was touch and go whether it was economically viable to keep it going, really. But I think it was. I'm glad that we did keep the decision to keep it open and try and turn it more into a business rather than a sort of hobby effort that was what he was doing, although still spending as if he had a Ford Works budget. And yes, I wish I had him to bounce ideas off, and I wish we could bask in some of the same successes, but it's been good to keep it open, and I'm glad that the name is still out there. From the very early days, I would sort of go to the races and be a bit of a gopher and go and get diff oil or fuel or coffees or that sort of thing, and it just piece by piece got more and more involved, and then in about 2014 I decided to completely go full time. And it is a difficult business. It's not. It's complicated, and there are lots of pitfalls to fall into, and we weren't very well funded from the outset. We had assets obviously and a good name and some cars and things like that, but it's probably not the ideal conditions you'd think to start up a business of this type. But I was very fortunate that I had lots of people involved who were there in the 60s and knew my father and had worked with him, and one mechanic in particular, Brian Lewis, who was there from the outset in *64 and was a mine of information and knew how to prepare a car to the highest standard. And based on the relationship there, it sort of went well, but it was a plunge for sure. Yeah. Well, it's mostly race preparation, historic race car preparation, primarily with Fords that were associated with the team in the 60s. And in particular Mustangs, we seem to have done more with those than any other of the types. And we also do engineering services and bits and pieces of work on road cars and other projects to keep the workshop busy. But yeah, historic racing is really the focus of it. We've had a high standard set a long time ago, and it's difficult to live up to in some respects. But the cars in the 60s were always very well presented and well prepared, and we do our best to maintain that standard. But it is also a very different world now than it was then. It's not always possible to apply the rules that my father followed in the 60s to make things work today, and it's much more customer based and not, a factory effort all working for one thing. But I do have his voice and various others of the old guys from the 60s voices in my ear sometimes when deciding things to maintain high standards. The historic racing is very competitive today, probably a lot more competitive than the races were in the 60s, and therefore development is necessary, but also you're limited by the FIA rulebook and the period technology that you have to use. So yes, there is a lot of development, but it's fine-tuning. You can't do what you would like to do on the cars to make them faster. So it has to be subtly done and within the rulebook. So yes, there are a lot of tweaks, especially on saloon cars, to make them work. And but we're fortunate in that technology has dragged us on, and even something like the engine oils make the engines are so much more powerful and reliable than they used to be. So some things have been made easier, but I think in the 60s people got away with a lot more. The Mustang in particular, it's important to maintain it on the weight, and the homologation weight is fairly low for a car of its power, but inevitably if you just built it sort of without paying massive attention to the weight, then you would be probably 100 kilos over or 80 kilos over the weight. So that's a big factor, and it's more lots of little things than big jumps really, and just gradual refinement and finding out what works and what doesn't, and how far you can push things. But there are no obvious major tweaks that we've done that have tumbled the lap times. The engine power has gone up even since the early days of the revival, probably getting 40 or 50 horsepower now these days than they did then. And the roll cage design has probably stiffened the chassis a great deal, which has been led in as well by the FIA and increasing safety standards. And I think data analysis has been probably a big factor in that as well, because that's become more affordable and more common, and drivers can really analyse their styles and sort of bring the times down. I'd like to keep it going as a, you know, last year was a tricky year for everyone in the business and everyone in the country, indeed, in the world. But it would be nice to keep doing what we're doing, but also some more road car work, I think, perhaps, you know, more doing a Mustang road car which has some modern performance, more modern features, creature comforts and performance, is an idea that's actively being pursued at the moment, but really just expanding the racing and keeping the name out there at the front of the grid, hopefully.